Hello everyone and welcome. We're going to talk today about stress and trauma-related disorders. We've had a lengthy history and we fully understand that stress and health are related. When we're talking about stress-related disorders, these are now those diagnosable conditions that might be caused by stress or trauma, or they're significantly exacerbated by the experience of stress and trauma. When we're talking about stress, these are things that can be psychological, and stress can be physiological. So our psychological and our physiological reactions to situations that are demanding that we make some kind of adaptation is what we think of as a stress. And the kinds of adaptations I'm referring to can be things that are physical as well as things that are psychological. And stressors are all around us. They are virtually anything that you can imagine, because something is deemed a stressor if it is something that is putting pressure on us as an organism to change, adapt, or adjust. So this means stressors are not necessarily always going to be bad. If it's something that requires we make a change, that we adjust and adapt, then that is a stressor. And the way we adapt will include things that are both physiological as well as factors that are psychological. I'm going to show you two columns of events. This first column is from the College Life Stress Inventory, and the numbers behind each of the items are stress points that are allotted to the event if you've experienced it. So a relative scale of how severe, how stressful would this be? How much does this make a demand on you to adapt, change, or adjust? So just take a moment to take a look at that. You see going to a game is 20, death of a friend is 98, a breakup is 85, declaring a major is 65. And the second column is the general life events inventory for adults. And this does not include stress points or the number of points allotted for each of the events, but just take a look at what's on there. Getting a new job, getting married, having a baby, being sued, legal problems. Some of those probably seem really natural, that they're going to be stressful events. But I wonder if there are things on this list that are also a bit surprising. Things that might seem strange to have as a stress inventory, things that maybe don't seem like they should be all that stressful. Typically, in looking at this list, people will note things like, why would getting straight A's be stressful? Well, there's a lot that went into the process of getting straight A's, and there's probably a lot of buildup in wondering how are you going to pan out by the end of that semester. And those things are incredibly stressful. Declaring a major. There is a host of decisions and thinking processes that went into declaring the major, and this is something that's going to have an impact on the next several years of your life and maybe your career choices. Going to a game. Well, there's lots of things that happen at a game that are going to require that you make an adaptation or an adjustment, that you make some changes. And those kinds of things are stressors to your system, and that stress requires that you respond. There's also things that are incredibly positive for most people, but are extremely stressful. So having a new baby, this might be a wonderful event, but if you've ever met anyone who's on day 6 of being incredibly sleep deprived because a baby has been up and screaming at night, they can attest that this is an incredibly stressful event. Getting married, if you've ever seen Bridezillas, you've seen that no matter how positive the marriage and the preparations might be, it's requiring a set of adaptations on an ongoing basis that can be incredibly taxing for someone. And we know that dealing with a chronic stressor is a process. It is not a single moment in time. And this process has been deemed the general adaptation syndrome. The first stage in this process is this alarm stage. Here we're confronted with a stressor and our bodies recognize that the stressor exists, and we have to determine what our appropriate response will be. This is the moment of fight, flight, or freeze. So essentially, at this point, our body has experienced some damage, but it's not beyond the point where it can adapt. So it's able to make some adaptations, but the bodies, if you look at the bottom, that line, the straight line demonstrates our normal resistance level. So if you think of it as our resistance to harm, our resistance to negative outcomes with stress, at this alarm stage, our resistance actually drops a little bit below our norm. But if we successfully handle this stressor, and it's a short-lived, moderate amount of stress, this is not going to overtax our system. So we're able to bounce back and recover from this kind of event. The problem is when stress continues and persists after this point. So if we have this moment, short-lived, moderate amount of stress, our body is able, our resistance drops, but then our body is able to repair itself and heal itself, and try specifically to heal itself in ways that ensure its survival by being better equipped to handle repeated exposure to the damage that was caused. So this is similar to if you get a cut and you develop a scar, that area that's scarred is a little tougher than the skin around it often. So we're able to better adapt and improve our reactions to those kinds of stressors in case we encounter them again. However, having to continually deal with stress, being in the second stage of adaptation and resistance, our body is often able to mobilize resources and to handle the stress better. We've become more resilient to that kind of stress, but the problem is our body still isn't designed to cope with this indefinitely. So eventually, if that stress continues, and if you think about people who are experiencing chronic life stressors, they eventually are going to move into stage 3. This is when stress is chronic. We have now moved into the exhaustion stage, and here the adaptation is unable to adequately occur because there's been so much damage so much that's been damaged at that point, and that damage has become too great, either in its magnitude or in its frequency. At this point, our body begins to collapse under the pressure of that stress, and our physical and psychological resources become further depleted. It's in this exhaustion stage where we start to see the onset of illness and disability, things like the development of colds, cancer, adjustment disorders, and depression, and things of that nature. And you can think about this if you've ever known someone who has been dealing with the stress of the semester and they make it through finals, and maybe during finals or right after finals, all of a sudden they get a cold, they become sick, they're laying in bed for a couple of days. This reflects that same process where they were mobilizing resources and coping with the stress, but after doing so for so long, their body succumbs to the fatigue, their resistance level drops significantly, and now the germs and things in the air that they were normally able to fight off, now they succumb to those. Because we are constantly bombarded with stress, We need to have ways of coping and dealing with stress, and we also need to have a solid understanding of the different ways in which stress shows up and the kinds of things that may be useful or helpful. If you look at the research literature, you're going to see lots of discussion about various styles of coping. They are broken into different ways. You'll see some talk about active coping versus passive coping. Some will talk about whether it's an approach or a retreat process, or approach and avoidance process. But most of those different mechanisms or definitions of coping can be broken down into either emotion-focused or problem-focused coping. Emotion-focused, which is typically where things like passive coping is put. Here, the goal is to reduce the extent to which the situation is bothering me, reduce the emotional impact that it's having on me, but not necessarily changing the stressor itself. A lot of my research is in the realm of sexual harassment and in organizations. So if I were to look at sexual harassment within an organization as an example, this might be someone who isn't trying to do anything to stop the harassment directly. So they're not telling the person something, they're not reporting. Instead, maybe they're trying to deny that it's a big deal. Maybe saying, well, you know, the guy who harassed me, yeah, it wasn't really all that big a deal, and they minimize it. Or maybe they are trying to avoid the person so that they are less likely to be harassed. So they take the long route to the bathroom so that they don't have to pass the desk of the person that typically harasses them. These are all ways that they are containing the amount that they are upset by the harassment, but they're not actually changing the harassment itself. Then there's also problem-focused coping, and this is often described as active or action-focused coping. Here, they're actively trying to change the problem itself. Going back to our example of harassment, this would be the person who directly confronts the person harassing them and tells that person to stop harassing them, or they try to file a report with their human resources department about the harassment. When you look at the research, they often discuss these two as emotion-focused is bad, problem-focused coping is good. And there are many situations where that dichotomy maps out and makes sense. But the harassment literature also shows us that we need to be more thoughtful in the ways that we are thinking about active or emotion-focused coping versus problem-focused coping. There are times when emotion-focused coping may actually be better for the individual in that particular situation compared to problem-focused coping. And we need to stop pathologizing those that choose an emotion-focused strategy over a problem-focused strategy. As another example from the harassment literature, typically reporting the harassment is associated with a host of negative outcomes and a host of stressful events that actually, for many people, make the situation far worse. So reporting harassment under those circumstances leads to negative well-being and negative health, and they may have been better choosing an emotion-focused strategy. So again, it's not to say that one is always right and the other is always wrong, but to encourage us to think in a more nuanced manner about why people may cope in the way they do, and that for some, particular coping styles might be the best option for them in a particular situation. And we've already talked quite a bit in class about social support, but social support is another really powerful way of coping with stressful events. Seeking out social support or merely having increased connection with other people. So sometimes this is the very typical cry on a friend's shoulder and share the pain you're in. Other times it can be merely talking with people, not even about the issue, but having the kind of connection that you get from having social conversations. And it can even be as simple as going to the store and having a short positive exchange with the cashier clerk. We know that social support has a variety of benefits, and these are benefits both physical health is improved, but also psychological well-being is enhanced when people have social support. But we can't forget that social support networks matter, and specifically what matters is what is the size of that social support network and what's the quality of that social support network. And we've already talked about this a little bit in talking about elderly people with physical health or mental health challenges and how social contact can improve their outcomes. But let's think about this even with another example and ways that the social support network size and quality are both important. So imagine a single dad in New York with 2 small children that are in elementary school. He lives on the 3rd floor of an apartment building with no elevator, and he has broken his femur, the big bone in the thigh. So he can't get up and down the stairs anymore. Imagine this single dad has a really, really great friend. This friend does everything. The friend is coming every morning to get the kids fed and to take the kids to school, picks the kids up after school and brings them home, has been cooking all of their meals and helping to clean the house because dad can't get around yet. That is high quality social support. But the social support network is only one person. How fast would you burn out that one social support person in that network? Pretty darn fast, right? So that would be an example where you have a high quality social support network, but it's too small to stay effective. That person may do really well, but taking on that level of work in another household in addition to their own will likely result in them hitting that exhaustion stage, and now maybe they've become sick or exhausted. So let's look at now the kind of social support you might get in social media. You may have that same single dad reaching out on social media and talking about, I broke my leg and this is really awful and it's really hard to do things. And there might be 100 responses about, oh, we hope you feel better. We're thinking about you. Hang in there. Well, that's a social support network that's really large, but it's not of significant quality or depth to get the dad's needs met. So really, you're shooting for that optimal social support network in both size and in quality. So envision that this dad now has 4 or 5 friends who are really good friends and jumping in to help, and they're alternating who picks up the kids from school or who takes them to school every day, and they're alternating in cooking extra food and having meals sent over. Maybe one night a week, one of them will order something and have it sent to the house. The next night someone cooks. The third night another person makes an order. They are chipping in to have help with getting the house cleaning done. This is a level of effort that even after a few months is likely to be sustainable by that social support network. That between these 5 friends, for the 3 months the person is off their feet, they can manage that extra help and not succumb to exhaustion. Ethnic identity. Looking within the U.S., we know that some ethnic minority groups seem to show a significant amount of resistance to stress. which begs the question of why would that be? There are a variety of different reasons, but one that's particularly important appears to be ethnic identity. For African Americans or Black Americans, having pride in their cultural heritage appears to create additional resilience in the face of adversity. So having a sense of your group as valuable, as having pride in your group's contributions and your group as a whole helps you cope with the adverse events that happen in your life. Acculturative stress. Acculturative stress is this process of adaptation one has to go to when they leave their home environment and go into a new cultural environment. So imagine new immigrants to the United States. What's interesting about the acculturative process is that there seem to be problems if people completely acculturate and kind of fully immerse themselves into the new culture, but there's also problems if they acculturate too little and don't submerge themselves at all in the new culture. That sweet spot seems to be those who develop a bicultural identity. The bicultural identity are those individuals who are able to fit into both their own cultural group as well as make the adaptations with this new cultural group in which they now find themselves. Those individuals experience psychological protection and fare better under adversity. These individuals typically will have more cognitive flexibility, better problem solving. They tend to be more socially successful and as a result have greater number of social supports. I mean, envision this is the person who is able to go out into mainstream culture, interact successfully, speak the language, and know the norms and the patterns of interaction that allow them to be welcomed there. But they also can go back into their own community and interact with members of their community and speak the language and honor the norms around interactions and be successful in that context as well. So this ability to do this back and forth between the two cultures naturally and comfortably creates psychological protection and improved well-being. Stresses related to racism, acculturative stress, discrimination, these things have real costs for the targets. And sadly, one way that we measure the prices paid for targets is in the excess death rate. This calculates the number of deaths across different groups while holding factors constant that we know impact health, well-being, and longevity. So they would hold constant things like socioeconomic status, whether or not the person has health insurance, do they have access to health care, and even after they control for all of these variables, they find that more ethnic minorities die. And when they look at why there are differences in these death rates, and they've controlled for all the various things they can think to control for, the consistent difference seems to be the persistent stress related to racism, and that this persistent racism-related stress takes a toll on the health and well-being of people of color, and it results in higher rates of death for people of color compared to whites in the United States. So in the US, we already know that there are vast differences in rates of things like hypertension, which is heavily influenced by stress. And if we were to look across ethnic groups, we'd see significant differences in rates of hypertension. And in the US, Black Americans typically have extremely high rates of hypertension for both men and women. This is argued to be related to the stresses of racism and discrimination and higher levels of poverty, and potentially also due to things like eating different foods. And so when we're thinking about hypertension, the logical extension of that is to think about heart disease and heart disease related death. This particular table summarizes the number of deaths related to heart disease across ethnic groups in the United States. And as you can see, African Americans, Black Americans are leading the pack among those that are dying due to heart disease. And again, this is thought to largely be related to discrimination and racism-related stress, because they've been able to control for all of the other variables and they still see an excess death rate. However, deaths due to stress is a problem in the US more generally as well. So if you look at these data, at the bottom is the United States, and you see that the rates of deaths per year due to coronary heart disease outpace almost every other part of the world. But interestingly, you see that Australia ranks similarly in its number of heart-related deaths. And if you try to think about what might be some of the reasons why the US and Australia are leading the world in deaths related to heart disease, I'm willing to bet that a lot of the reasons you're coming up with are actually stress related. So if you think about things like the number of hours a week people are working, the number of vacation days, the amount of stress in navigating environments, there are a variety of reasons why this continues to be a significant challenge for both the United States and Australia. So of course, what can we then do? There are a variety of ways to combat stress. What do we need to do about them? Not all of the ones that we use currently are necessarily good ones. So people will self-medicate using food, drugs, alcohol to help minimize their experience of the stress and make themselves feel better. It can also be useful to identify what those stressors are so that we can go about the process of mobilizing our coping responses and resources appropriately. We can practice gratitudes. There's been fascinating work demonstrating that the simple act of expressing gratitudes on a regular basis can dramatically change the way we think about our experiences in the world and can dramatically lower anxiety and stress. To give you an example, something as simple as making yourself identify 3 things that you're grateful for every single day. Today, it's snowy, it's dreary, but I can be grateful for the fact that I have heat and I don't have to be out in the snow right now. I can be grateful for the fact that I might be able to have a snowball fight later. So being able to identify 3 things you're grateful for every single day, and ideally trying to do it in real time versus waiting to the end of the day and coming up with 3 things, it begins to change the things that you notice in your environment, change your focus, and reduce your perception of stress as being problematic. Of course, exercise on a regular basis is helpful, engaging in meditation. And meditation does not have to be the kinds of things that we have often thought about in the past, where you have to sit in a quiet room or stare at a flame. There is a wonderful app called Headspace. And they, I believe, just reduced their rates for students. But it's an app that takes you through exercises so that you can become mindful. And mindfulness is a psychological term for being very present in the ways you're thinking and being very deliberate in changing how you're thinking to be in the present, to be in the now, not to dwell on negative thoughts or past events. So Headspace is a wonderful way, and it's a meditation-based app, but it's very different from other types of meditation. Of course, increasing your number of social contacts, using stress management techniques, and of course, as a psychologist, I have to encourage you to think about therapy when either you're wanting to learn new strategies or you're coping with something that is significant in size or distress and not sure how to do that. And I also encourage you to think about some other ways in which you might be able to help cope with stress. If you have these items available to you, if you keep yourself present of the various ways that you can cope with stress, it can be very helpful when stressful things happen and you can remember, oh right, I need to make sure I get to the gym because I've been under a lot of stress lately. So moving from talking about stress and talking about the impact of stress, there are also a body of disorders called the trauma-related disorders that are really quite unique in the DSM, because these are the only disorders in the entire DSM that require that you can identify an etiological event, meaning you can identify the stressful event that is the basis of these symptoms. And none of the other DSM diagnoses require that you do that. So the first of these three is adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder is perhaps the most mild diagnosis in the DSM. It's basically saying that you're having a maladaptive reaction to a stressor that we can pinpoint. We can identify what that stressor is, and that within 3 months of that stressor, you started having symptoms that were challenging for you. And we define this as either that the symptoms are clinically significant and that they either exceed the stress you're experiencing around them is exceeding what would be typical for that event, or it's causing some kind of impairment in a domain of life, like your occupational functioning or your social life, that some part of your world is not working as it should because of the stress and distress you're experiencing. Now, it's important to say that as psychologists, we think about this as distress exceeding what we'd expect for the stressor after we account for other external factors and cultural factors that might influence symptom severity and symptom presentation. So we try to be thoughtful and mindful of those things in ascertaining whether or not this is a response to that stressor that is out of proportion with what we would normally expect. Adjustment disorder also rules out, or also states that you have to be able to identify the fact that the symptoms are related to that stressor and it's not merely exacerbating some other disorder. Case in point, if someone already had major depressive disorder and then they experienced the stressful event and the symptoms they were having were merely an exacerbation of that already existing major depressive disorder, you wouldn't want to also now give them an additional diagnosis. You would only give this diagnosis if the symptoms were distinct in that they were related to their reaction to that stressor and they were not simply exacerbating something else. You also would not give adjustment disorder if they're having a normal response to having lost a loved one or bereavement. And for it to be adjustment disorder, we would expect that after the condition has been dealt with, so after the stressor is over, and when I say the stressor is over, I'm also referring to the consequences of that stressor. So once the stressor and its consequences have ended, within 6 months, we should see that the symptoms of the adjustment disorder have also ended. This is basically saying that if you are really and truly having this response as a result of the stressor, and that the symptoms have not exacerbated to the point of becoming a new disorder, that when the stressor and the consequences have ended, so too should the symptoms related to it. And with adjustment disorder, you would provide any number of what we call specifiers at the end of the disorder. The specifiers are designed to give the next person working with you additional information on the way your condition has manifested. So we would say adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or adjustment disorder with anxiety, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, with disturbance of conduct, with disturbance of emotions and conduct, or unspecified, which would basically be that rare person where none of those other descriptions were sufficient. And again, these are just ways of providing a little more detail and context for the way one's symptoms are manifesting. When looking at prevalence rates, you see that up to anywhere from 5 to 20% of those receiving outpatient mental health services are diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. In inpatient settings, you might see that up to 50% of them are diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. And although adjustment disorder is perceived as a mild diagnosis, it is associated with increased risk for suicide attempts and with completed suicide. So it's not something that should be overlooked or dismissed. Moving to our second disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. The first thing that has to happen is we need to be able to identify a stressor that the symptoms are related to. So the process is first determining if a stressor has occurred and does it meet our stress criteria, or you'll often hear people refer to criterion A. Criterion A says that there has been exposure to actual death or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in at least one critical way. They have either directly experienced the event, or they witnessed it personally as it was happening to someone else. They may have learned that the event happened to someone that they loved. This may be actual or a threatened death, or violence, or an accident like a car accident. So learning that this has happened to someone you care deeply about. Another way would be experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of an event. This often happens, for example, with police who are frequently having to investigate child abuse cases, or paramedics, first responders who are witness to the various ways that individuals can be maliciously or accidentally harmed. This last one about repeated exposure, interestingly, does not apply to exposure from electronic media, TV, movies, pictures, unless it's work-related. This distinction is an interesting one, and I don't have a good explanation for the distinction, but a piece of it is this element of choosing into that environment. For example, police officers being exposed to pictures of children that have experienced abuse, that's part of what they have to do for their job. And so they are not in a position to easily elect out of doing that. Whereas watching horror flicks, somebody who's choosing to watch horror flicks because they enjoy that genre, we would not expect that they would have PTSD as a result. This way of defining that traumatic stressor has morphed over time. Back with the DSM-3, it was the trauma was described as something that was beyond the scope of normal human experience. And this was thought of as something so incredibly extreme that it's almost unheard of and uniquely traumatic as a result. Part of this also relates to the history of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that it received serious study in response to seeing people go off to war and experience combat and came back with these series of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So much of the early research and attention to this issue was based on military combat, which at the time would have been almost exclusively males. And it was research being done with the US military. Part of what was problematic is this was not capturing the many people who had all of the exact same symptoms, but the experience they had didn't qualify as beyond the scope of normal human experience. That had been largely defined only to things like being in combat, experiencing something like genocide, which would still be probably considered at least a war effort. But that means people who experienced it because of being beaten by parents or intimate partner violence or sexual assault were not deemed significant enough events to count as a traumatic stressor. So they would not qualify for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, even if they had all of the other symptoms. So this was incredibly problematic, as you can imagine, and the DSM-4 changed to the person has been exposed to a traumatic event where A and B have happened. A being person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others, and that their response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And this was a significant improvement in the way that we could think about trauma, because it allowed a host of events that never before used to count, like sexual assault, like domestic violence, to now fit within this definition, where maybe there wasn't serious physical injury, but the person had reason to believe that it could result in their death or serious injury. This new definition also allowed that you could be traumatized because you didn't directly experience it, but you knew that the threat existed with someone that you cared about, or that you witnessed it happening to someone else. Whereas with the original DSM-3 experience, you had to personally experience it, and it had to be beyond the realm of normal human experience. So this definition opened the doors for many more things to be included. And it also reflected the fact that the individual may have a response that's different from what someone else may have. So I could have intense fear, helplessness, and horror, but someone else may have the same experience, and they did not respond with a sense of fear, helplessness, and horror, and then as a result did not develop a trauma response. So that new definition was incredibly important in moving the field forward. It's also now, it became that first step to the way we now define a stressful event or a traumatic stressor. So all of that is just in our efforts to define that traumatic stressor, because that first criterion requires that there be a traumatic stressor event that we can pinpoint when we're talking about the rest of the symptoms. So what are the rest of the criteria? Item B, criterion B, says you have to be able to identify at least one intrusion symptom. Intrusion is ways in which the memory of the event plays out in your life, but you did not want it to, you did not try to think about it, it was not intentional. For example, after the traumatic event happens, now there are intrusive memories of the event. Imagine sitting in class and getting a memory of a severe car accident that you may have been in. When you weren't trying to think about it, there weren't things in the environment asking you to think about it. It reflects that your brain is still just kind of working on that material all the time. So it suddenly just comes back to you. Now in children, these kind of things will show up differently. So for children, if you look at the way they play, you'll see they're constantly repeating things that are related to that traumatic event. So their play may repeatedly show car crashes after they've been in a serious car crash. Another way you can have intrusive memories of the event is reflected in having distressing dreams. And for adults, you'll see that these dreams are directly related to the event. So they might have distressing dreams over and over again of a car accident. But in young children, they may have dreams that they are afraid of and they're experiencing negatively, but they aren't able to recognize or readily talk about the content in a way that might directly link it to the event. But again, all of these would be shifts that have happened after they had this traumatic event. 3, dissociative reactions. Feeling like it's happening again, like the event is occurring again. This is what we typically would refer to as flashbacks. And when we're having flashbacks, this could be someone who is having a flashback, but they recognize it's not, I'm here in an office, I'm not out in a car where the accident is happening. But people can have these be so severe that they have zero awareness of the fact that of their current surroundings, where for them the flashback is so all-encompassing that they may actually perceive their environment as being the environment they were in at the time. And in kids, you'll see this as the constantly reenacting the trauma in their play. Number 4, intense or prolonged distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble the event. And that's a lot in one, but it's reflecting the idea that if you see something or if you have something that reminds you of the event, that distress is either very, very strong or it lasts for a significant amount of time. So perhaps the car that hit you was a little yellow love bug. And now anytime you see a yellow car, you have an incredibly intense negative reaction. Or you have a negative reaction that keeps lasting for most of the day. You can't kind of get it out of your head. And there could be marked physiological reactions to these internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble the event. So I start to feel a reaction internally, something that maybe that's reminding me of the thing that happened in the car accident, and now my body is having an extreme response physiologically to that memory. So again, intrusion symptoms are all of the ways that the event is coming back to you and it's creating a psychological reaction or a physiological reaction that you're having a very difficult time shaking. That it's symbolizing that this event is still active in your mind and body in a way that you can't shake or get rid of. And the third category is C, avoiding stimuli associated with the traumatic event. This can be efforts to avoid thinking about it, efforts to avoid the kinds of feelings that you had when it was going on or memories of it. It will often manifest as people trying to avoid things in the environment that might remind them of what happened or create a series of feelings similar to what happened to them. So avoiding seeing any yellow cars because they remind you of the car that hit you in the car accident. And then D, negative changes in thoughts and mood associated with the event. And here you're looking for there being at least 2 separate symptoms. So perhaps they can't remember an important aspect of the event. And this is really important because this would not include somebody had a car accident and they hit their head and they can't remember some part of the event because they have a concussion or because they had some brain damage. It also would not include if you can't remember something because there was a drug involved or the person had been drinking when it happened. This is specifically looking at not remembering part of the event because of dissociative amnesia, and an amnesia that's occurring because psychologically it's too distressing, not because there's any mechanism that would impair your ability to remember. So not being able to remember important aspects of the event. And one way in which I hear this when individuals had a lot of trauma in childhood, they might say, well, I don't really remember much of my childhood at all, as an example. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about themselves, about the world, about how other people are. People may talk about things like feeling that they're worthless, feeling that no one else in the world can be trusted, so they have to stay on guard for everyone at all times, or even beliefs that because this thing happened to me, I'm now sullied, I'm soiled in some way, I'm personally ruined. No one could ever love me because this happened. So persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs about self, others, or the way the world works. And persistent, distorted thoughts about why it happened, what caused it to happen, and having inappropriate levels of blame for self and towards self or others. So thinking that I was in a car accident because I didn't have on a bright enough jacket, and so now this happened and it's all my fault and I somehow deserve this to happen because I was so foolish in not wearing a bright enough jacket. Having a persistent negative emotional state, so someone who's still their significant emotional reaction in the world is being terrified and fearful, or being constantly angry, or even having persistent feelings of shame and guilt. Diminished interest or participation in activities. You'll hear this come up again when we talk about depression, but this would refer to since the trauma happened, they used to like going swimming, and now they don't want to go swimming in the pool. They also don't want to hang out and talk with friends. They don't want to get up and go to their favorite class. That it seems to have significantly changed the way they think about their life and their interest in doing those kind of activities. Detachment and estrangement from others. People will sometimes talk about they don't feel a strong connection to people. They don't want to be around other people, particularly people they may have found comforting or soothing in the past. Now they feel very distant and detached from those people. Or an inability to experience positive emotions. This is kind of the flip of number 4, but these things, you could have somebody who frequently is afraid or feels guilt or shame, but they're still able to feel happiness and joy. So these are related, but they're a little bit different. So in 7, here the person may say, you know, I never really feel very happy. At best, I'm just kind of blah. I never feel happiness. I never have really strong loving feelings for others. I don't feel much satisfaction or joy. I just feel blah all the time. E, changes in arousal and reactivity that are associated with the onset of the event. So again, this is saying these aren't merely that you have these symptoms, it's that these symptoms seem to be connected to a particular traumatic event that has happened. For it to be post-traumatic stress disorder, it must last more than a month. The symptoms must last for more than a month. The person must have clinically significant impairment. So remember, that's significant levels of distress, or it's impairing their ability to function in multiple areas of their life. The symptoms you're seeing cannot be the result of substance use or a medical condition. And you'll see this throughout the semester. Over and over and over again, the disorders will say, basically, that if this is because they're on a particular medication, you shouldn't count it. If the symptoms are because they were drinking or on a particular drug, you shouldn't give the diagnosis. Or if they have a medical condition that's causing these symptoms, you shouldn't give the diagnosis. All of that actually makes perfect sense. It's saying if there's something else that caused this symptoms that you're seeing, then you should be addressing that something else, not giving them another diagnosis. And similar to what we talked about with adjustment disorder, you can have specifiers for post-traumatic stress disorder. You could say post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative symptoms or with delayed expression. Delayed expression refers to those individuals where even if they've had some symptoms, they did not reach full criteria, they didn't have all of the symptoms until at least 6 months after the event happened. So very often people have symptoms immediately after. Usually they will have these symptoms in the immediate months after. This would be the rare person who doesn't have symptoms until 6 months after the event has happened, which is not typical, but it can indeed happen. And when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but the idea that one person could have the experience and they not respond in the same way, and another person they did not respond in the same way to another person, so one develops PTSD and one doesn't. So in trying to think about this, there seems to be differences in the development of PTSD that are related to people, and there's some that are related to the traumatic event itself. Specifically, what kind of traumatic event it is, how severe it was, how long it lasts, and how close they were to the event. Was it something that directly happened to them? Was it something that they directly witnessed? Was it something that they saw in pictures, something they heard about? The closeness they have to that event is more or less likely to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Across the lifetime, we see ranges in studies for how many people across the lifetime are likely to have PTSD, and they've pretty reliably determined that roughly 8 to 9% of people across their lifetime will have PTSD. We know that different types of crimes or experiences are likely to result in PTSD. In particular, things that are interpersonal, things where another person willfully hurt you, are associated with higher rates of PTSD. Particularly sexual assault, rape. These are events that are much more likely to result in PTSD. The highest rates of PTSD are found when individuals experience rape, when they've been in combat, military combat, and held captive, when they've experienced internment or imprisonment that was motivated by either political differences or a desire to target particular ethnic groups, or if someone experiences genocide, the idea that another group of people tried to kill all members of your community is very high likelihood to result in post-traumatic stress disorder. There also appears to be a higher rate of women having post-traumatic stress disorder compared to men, although this is controversial because the numbers over time have said differently. But some of those differences have been because of the ways we thought about a trauma, and that many of the things women experienced were not considered traumatic events for a lot of our history. And it may also be attributed to the higher rates of women experiencing interpersonal violence and rape. So more women experience rape compared to men, although the numbers among men are sizable. More women are likely to be the target of domestic violence, and the fact that they are targeted for higher rates of interpersonal violence and rape are associated with their higher rates of PTSD. And now moving to our final disorder in this category, acute stress disorder. Acute stress disorder has all of the same criteria as post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're not going to go through the criteria again because they are all exactly the same. But remember, for post-traumatic stress disorder to be appropriate, it has to last longer than 1 month. So there is a need to provide some frame for those individuals who are having these symptoms, but it hasn't been a month. Or they had the symptoms, and it didn't last for over a month. And that's where acute stress disorder comes in. Acute stress disorder provides the appropriate diagnosis for people that have had these symptoms, again, all of the same criteria as PTSD and all the same severity as PTSD, for at least 3 days to up to 1 month after they've experienced a trauma. So this is doing a couple things. This is accounting for the group of people who have all the symptoms, but they go away before a full month has passed. And it also provides a mechanism to diagnose people that have all the symptoms and it hasn't been a month yet. Because approximately 50% of those who have PTSD initially qualified for acute stress disorder. And so it was necessary to determine if it was going to continue on before giving them PTSD, but this was the initial, acute stress disorder was the initial disorder that they were given. And we see that 20 to up to 50% of those who have had an interpersonal trauma will have acute stress disorder. If there's a non-interpersonal trauma, for example, a natural disaster, you see that in just under 20% of the cases. Physical assault, it's just under 19%, and in car accidents, you'll see anywhere from 13 to 20-ish% will have developed acute stress disorder in response.